And so welcome along. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much, Paul, for coming in to this live on air, which is all about evolution, memory, and Christian belief. I can see that we've got Peter Lane with us, and perhaps some others are going to join in later on. Peter, please do feel free to interject with comments and questions. Paul and Stuart won't be able to see those comments and questions, but I'll read them out to them. Well, I'm not going to ask Stuart to introduce himself because he will be well known to members of the Kiwi Connection that watch live on air. But I am going to ask Paul, would you like to say a few words about who you are and your background?
Yes. Well, I've been interested in nature from a very early age and have spent a lot of time out in the open. This is both for pleasure and for doing field work. Career-wise, I spent the first 9.5 years of my career in the South African Forestry Department, firstly in the management division, doing management work, and then later breeding trees for better timber quality. We got married, and then the two of us left for the United States, where we spent 5 years doing further study. In my case, it was genetics. After that, I returned to South Africa to a position at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, teaching genetics. And 23 years ago, I retired, a long time ago. And since then, my main hobby has been making my own amateur videos, a lot of which is concerned with nature. And also, I've been interested in reading about developments in various sciences which have been taking place.
That's a very rich and interesting background, Paul, particularly your work in genetics. And how long did you actually spend in the US as a student doing your doctorate, and then how long after that in research?
Well, we went to the United States. We were told that it would take about 2.5 to 4 years to complete a degree, a PhD, but it turned out, since I was working on maize, which has quite a long generation time, you only get 2 generations a year there, it took 5 years for those of us doing maize. Then at the University of the Witwatersrand, after we returned, I had a very heavy teaching load and a lot of administrative work, and did some research, but I'm not one of those people who can spend, you know, all 3 of those loaded up, you know, types of work like some of the others. You know, they'll be working 7 days a week, morning to night, and getting divorced right and left. You know, so I spent most of my time was on teaching and administrative work.
Right.
Took up a lot. Administrative work took up a lot of time. So I did some research. It was mainly on maize cytogenetics, the chromosomes of maize, and a couple of insects, bloodworms and Drosophila, and that was about it.
Okay. Well, I think you've got a very fascinating story to tell, and we'll gradually learn more about that story and your work in genetics over the course of the year in our Science and Faith group. But we've got a very specific question for you tonight, Paul. You became interested in the work of Marae, and particularly the question that I want to put to you is, what is the memory of a termite colony? Now, I've got a photo from Creative Commons here. This is an Australian rather than an African termite colony. But you looked very carefully at Eugene Moret's answer in The Soul of the White Ant, which I think is what he called the termite in his book. What do you make of the question?
Well, first of all, if the other person doesn't know, Moret regarded the termite colony, that mound you see there, as an organism. The whole thing is an organism, including the structure. It has its queen down below, inside. It has its worker termites and the soldier termites, and there are a whole lot of duties. It's like a city on its own. And the question is memory in termites. I didn't see anything about memory in Moret's book, so I Googled it this afternoon, and in the short time available, the only thing I could find was that there's evidence that some of the workers, when they're out foraging for food outside the nest, have a memory. They know or can communicate how far away that food is, the source of the food.
The termite, the construction of the mound is quite a complex feat of engineering, insofar as it gives rise to a temperature-controlled set of chambers that enable the survival of the. How do you think that this is just something that they habituated to, that it was a habit that they fell into, and that is the evolutionary answer, or is there something else that's going on?
I think it probably started as a much simpler system. As I see it, the memory must be an instinctive memory, which is in the brain of the queen and maybe the king ant when they start the colony. It's an instinctive memory with all the instructions, how to build the colony, how communication is regulated, how many of the eggs hatch or develop into soldiers and workers, and the design of the mound, because the design of some of these mounds which I've seen differ. Some are small round ones, others are taller like that one. It must be an instinctive memory that is there, which is inherited, and maybe as originally started as a fairly simple kind of memory which is inherited, in other words, instinct, and then with further development was expanded. For example, I've seen that there's evidence that some spiders can learn. In other words, they have a memory. And if that's possible, that instinct, the retention of that memory on a hereditary basis developed at the same time or in conjunction with the original memory. And even much simpler organisms like Caenorhabditis, which is a small worm about 1 millimeter long, and it consists only of about 3,000 to 4,000 cells, they've shown to have a memory. So memory goes a long way back down the line. And I'm sure instinct also has developed, expanded in certain organisms during more complex, design of the organisms and their habits.
I think that that's a really interesting perspective, that from very, very simple creatures, the worm that you described, through to more complex organisms, the termites. And of course, in a few minutes, we're going to discuss the human creature and part of its memory. But the clue, Paul, I think, is in what you said, that memory somehow is tied up all the way back down the chain. And I think this is one of the really interesting things about the topic. Now, I see a question has come through from Max Thompson, and I'll just read Max's question for you, Paul, and then we'll move on to Stuart's reply. Max is just asking, is there a fixed ratio of soldiers to workers in the termite colonies?
I don't know how fixed the ratio is. I've read on the internet that the number of soldiers, or the proportions, is regulated, because if there's a shortage of workers due to some reason, the production of workers is increased, and the same goes for soldiers. And also, if I remember correctly, if there are too many of one of the castes, they kill off the excess ones to get it back to normal.
I think I read in Murray that if there was an excess of soldier termites, as they went out, others from the nest would come back and cut them off at certain strategic points. So there was clearly a battle between members of the same colony. But when there were invasions, then everyone would act together for the good of the colony. But so there's all kinds of self-regulating going on within the colony. I think that's done Max's question, and I'm going to move on to Stuart. We want to move from these very simple creatures, Stuart, to the human creature, which is a little more complex, I think. And what we have here is, I'm going to say, cultural memory. And you're going to present us with one answer from Matt Ridley's book, The Evolution of Everything. Now, after we've done the broadcast, I will send out this PDF to all the participants in night school, and you can link to Stuart's summary of, he's looked at 7 chapters in Ridley's book, and you can see there from the title that Ridley looks at a whole lot of evolutions, life, he looks at culture, he looks at economy, he looks at education. It's an absolutely fascinating book. So let's just move on, and Stuart, you may want to now, would you like to just read us through the answer that you've written, and then we'll start to discuss it. What's cultural memory, Stuart?
Well, this is a summary of Ridley, of course. I'm not a scientist, as many of you know. I am interested in science. And from Paul's example with the termite, it's one of a number that Ridley gives of seeing nature as providing the way these sensitivities develop. And the other things he mentioned, which you may find fascinating, how an embryo grows into a body, how a bird builds its nest, and how a tree grows through its life. All these show a gradual movement on. He then goes on to
Stuart, I'm just going to interrupt you because there's a problem with your sound. We're getting quite a bit of feedback. Could you just move back a little from the computer screen? Try speaking now.
Okay, how's that?
No, we're still getting quite a bit of feedback. So I'll read what you've written about cultural memory, just so that we don't get the sound problem for everyone.
Okay.
And then we'll pick it up and see how we can go about discussing it. So Stuart says the human revolution showed a cultural change when about 200,000 years ago in Africa, humans started making many more stone tools than previously. Strictly speaking, it was an evolution rather than a revolution because it was very slow and cumulative. Richard Klein gives this as a biological explanation involving gene mutations as a response to culture. And Ridley continues the comparison to include things like the evolution of music and then later marriage. Now, I think Stuart's summary really picks up here. He talks about, or Ridley talks about, and Stuart's highlighted it, the swings between polygamy and monogamy, and links them to social, religious, and political factors, which make very interesting reading. And finally, the evolution of cities and institutions is described in ways that show these cultural changes to be regular and retrospectively predictable, but in ways that nobody did predict, let alone direct. In effect, they evolved. So let's just leave that sitting up there. Stuart, can you very briefly outline what are the swings between polygamy and monogamy? What did you discover in what Ridley had said about this in evolutionary terms?
Well, this was so new to me, David, that although I remember it impressed me at the time, I don't remember the facts enough to explain them to you.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, that might be quite good, Stuart, because that's a very bad breakup of sound at your end. So I'll just ask you to stand back at this point, and Paul and I will pick up the dialogue here. This will be a new experience for you, Paul. In terms of cultural evolution, I think what Ridley was trying to say was that it conferred an evolutionary advantage for Homo sapiens to just have one stable partner. This conferred certain cultural advantages, and probably the most important one was that it allowed the male of the species regular access in sexual terms to one female. But as societies and culture developed and you started to get more and more leaders exerting influences, the leaders of the pack started to deny most of the males their sexual expression. And so you've got this evolution of culture which has more and more, it's got more and more very powerful leaders who are saying, we're going to deny, through force, we're going to deny the majority of males their sex until we can organize them into troops similar to troops of armies and soldiers, etc. And then a little bit like the termites going out and doing battle between the colonies, we see the rise of territorial advantage. Now, I think that's that was Ridley's first and really quite surprising point, that as far as can be determined, monogamy is something that's part of the human trait for the last 200 or 1,000 or so years. Paul, do you have any comment about that?
I don't know. I haven't read Ridley's book, but you know, monogamy and so on. You go down the animal line, chimpanzees are in groups, baboons are in groups, and there's a dominant male, and wolves also, and a lot of antelopes and buck. It's a common thing that there's a dominant male with his herd, and I don't know how that ties up with culture.
Part of being in the group is is to start to gain cultural memory. And I think this is a fascinating topic. I'm wondering whether there's anyone in our viewers who would like to feed through their perspective. Ridley is very, very clear that monogamy confers an advantage on the human species. And at times, we see this, say, in the rise of Islam, where there's a big emphasis on polygamy. You also increase the rate of wars, fights for territory, and so on and so forth. And the cultural evolutionists would argue all the way back, according to Ridley this is, I can't say whether it's correct or not, but as soon as you take away that cultural advantage of monogamy, you start to see the species at war with itself. Do you think that might have any parallels to the world of the termites?
Culture. What does one mean by culture? I mean, the termites, is agriculture culture in the social sense?
Very much so. It's something that, and making tools, all of these things have conferred advantage through increasing technology. Yes.
Well, the termites, of course, culture a fungus. They harvest plant material, take it down into the nests, seed it with the fungus, and grow the fungus, and water it, and culture it. That's agriculture.
That's absolutely fascinating. Now, just enlighten me. Let's leave the human brain aside and enlighten me. What's the size of the termite brain?
It must be pretty small. I mean, termites I've seen, well, flying termites, the body is probably, not more than that length.
Right.
And ones I've seen running around, repairing nests and going out harvesting, collecting plant material, maybe. How many millimeters is that? 5? Just the body.
So, but not much of a brain sitting there, and yet they have the ability to do agriculture.
Yes.
Stuart, despite the broken nature of the sound, can you make a comment about that?
No, I'm fascinated, but I'm not too surprised that other organizations have their own culture and develop in very similar ways to Darwinian evolution.
Very similar ways to Darwinian evolution. Okay, that I think is the key. Let's, I haven't had any further questions through there yet, but let's pick up the screen share again. And I'm very sorry about Stuart not being able to contribute all that much. The feedback is really quite difficult. I've got a question that's just come through that perhaps I'll read out. I'll just select it. It's Peter Lane has written, evolutionary theory often cites the fact that the human female has no generally observable indication of immediate fertility as an evolutionary advantage that ensures the human male has a vested interest in looking after the female. And he says that provides a driver to establish family units. Now, I think that fertility in various animal species is at predictable times of the year. Is that what you're getting at? Would you read that as the case, Paul, that because you've got no observable indicator of immediate fertility, that makes the male need to look after the female?
I don't know if it applies generally. I might be wrong, but from what we read in Murray's book about the soul of the ape, which was baboons, the female baboons have very brightly coloured backsides at certain times, which I think is an indication that they're in, estrus. But I might be wrong there. But they are groups also. So
Yeah,
I really don't know.
yeah. Can you recall in the baboon colonies, you've got a dominant male, but do other males have access to females within the whole colony?
I'm not sure.
I don't know either. I can't recall from.
I've forgotten from. Yeah.
Yeah. You may know the answer to that, Peter, but it's a great point. Thank you. If that could be a driver to establish family units, that's something that we need to be aware of. So we're done answering that one, and I'll come back to sharing the final slide, which is about what has all of this got to do with Christian belief. And we've asked, what is the memory or habit within a termite colony? We've sort of tried to look at what's the habit or memory, how do you get cultural evolution and cultural memory, and how is this relevant to Christian memory? Well, Rupert Sheldrake, he's not speaking as a Christian here, but he's deeply spiritual sort of person. He proposed that evolution is the format of habits, the formation of habits, and he called the process by which this happens morphic resonance. Now, by morphic resonance, he means similar patterns resonate across space and time, much as a string resonates with various harmonics. So, in Sheldrake's understanding of evolution, memory slowly builds up in space and time and is distributed not necessarily across colonies, but across everything. So I think in Sheldrake's understanding of how the termites construct their mound, he would say that the brain of the termite is like the brain of the human being insofar as it's a receiver for these morphic resonances. And morphic resonances are patterns of habituated behavior. So that's, I'm not saying whether Sheldrake is right or wrong, but I suspect he's on the right track here. That's his understanding of memory. Now, Carl Jung, whom Murray read in The Soul of the White Ant and The Soul of the Baboon, he read Jung and he read Freud, and Murray, he proposed that there's a kind of a collective memory within the termite colony, and that's Jung's proposition that there's a collective unconscious world in which archetypes or resonances reside in all of us. And my question is, that's similar to the collective memory of the termite colony? And if you follow Sheldrake, you would say, yes, it is. Our brains are simply picking up on the resonances which are appropriate to our species, and these resonances form the patterns of our memory. Now, Max Thompson and I have had quite a debate about this in the past, and I think Wynne Davies as well. My belief is that Christian memory is about habits of Christ. As more and more people habituated themselves to the Christ way of doing things, slowly fields of morphic resonance built up that made it easier and easier for more and more people to do this. But as you've seen with the rise of Islam, and with other religious forms, and in particularly in Western culture, the rise of no religion, new resonances are building up, which are causing the slow falling away of the habituated memory of Christ. So that's my proposition. If you put Jung together with Sheldrake, we have our memories, and we have specifically Christian memories. They're part of our enculturation in Western society. But as fewer and fewer people now participate in the habits of Christ, it's easier and easier for more people to fall away from that. So I'll stop sharing the screen at that point. Are there any comments that anyone has that's either watching or Paul, particularly you? Stuart, I'd love for you to be able to, but keep it brief because of that sound quality.
Well, I just don't know. Thing. I think it's a concept that I would have to understand a bit more about.
Sheldrake, when he first proposed this, he had been working quite a bit in, I think, India, and was using a lot of the Vedic and Hindu understandings of science in modes that aren't Western, if you like. And when he wrote his first book, The Presence of the Past, the author, the editors of Nature, actually said this book should be burnt. They were so strongly opposed to Sheldrake, and it took decades and decades of quite careful work by him to start to get the idea a bit more firmly established that maybe memory is not located to the brain. Now, I think Murray, following Jung, also understood that that's probably the case. You can't establish any hard scientific evidence for it, but what you can do is, like Murray did, he carefully observed what was happening in the colonies. He didn't have all the scientific measuring equipment that we've got today, but he certainly had enough to powers of observation to be aware that somehow the colony had a soul of its own. And I don't think it requires too much work from the human point of view to realize that collectively as a species, we do tend to do things that are habitual, that somehow a habit has become ingrained within particular cultures. So you have a Christian culture, you have a Vedic culture, you have an Islamic culture, you've got a Jewish culture, and how the memory is transmitted down may not be the result of simply what goes on inside of one person's brain. Comment from you, Stuart.
Okay, well, according with your request, I'll make it brief. I don't believe, from observing trees growing, embryos turning into bodies, bird building nests, termites getting together and acting as if they've got an outside brain, but they haven't, that humans don't have the same kind of communicative possibilities within their culture. I can't just speak it.
Yeah. So in that sense, we're not separate from the things that go on in nature in other species. Now, just bear with me, everyone. Just as Stuart was speaking, I became aware of memory. A marvelous book is probably reversed on screen. It's called The Vortex of Life: Nature's Patterns in Space and Time by Lawrence Edwards, and I will put this in the PDF for distribution. What he is proposing is that it's not only a memory, but we are, if you like, formed in a particular way. This is the science of Rudolf Steiner, that our form dictates a huge amount of our later development as human beings. So it's not just memory, it is also the form. So I gave a sermon many years ago on this book, and it's brought to life again, and I'll make this my next sermon at Trinity at Waiaki, and we'll put it up on the net. The very careful explanations. He's a mathematician of some considerable ability, and his careful analysis, his careful observation in nature. So let's just select the question here. Max Thompson asks, is morphic resonance not geographically driven? That's a really good question, Max, in the sense that if you've got local termite mounds in Africa, Paul has mentioned that some were round, some were tall, some were particular structures. So it would appear as if you've got some geographic memory that's localized in the field of resonance, if you like. But across termites around the world, you've got an even more basic resonance that's at work. So it's not geographically driven altogether. You'd have to really look at in some detail, and it's really worth it. You'd look at Sheldrake's book, The Presence of the Past. Peter Lane has made a comment here. He says, I'd love to get my brother-in-law involved in this. He's a professor researching memory in the context of the grey areas between computer science and psychology. I have a feeling he may dispute the way we've been using memory. Well, actually, I totally agree. Huge numbers of people would dispute the way that I've been using the term memory, but I don't know that any one explanation takes precedence over other explanations in this, because it's the most strange and bizarre phenomenon. Peter, in a few weeks' time, I've got a young filmmaker, Demi Nabov, who's coming on live on air with me and Stuart McAdam. I can't remember the exact date. It's not all that long away, sometime this month or next. And we're discussing virtual reality. And he's particularly interested in virtual reality in the world of cinema. But I've asked him, well, what about how's virtual reality changing the world of education? Is virtual reality changing the way our memories also work? Are we not only enhancing our senses with virtual reality, are we also enhancing, or otherwise, our memories? So yeah, I'd love to see your brother-in-law get involved with this discussion. I'm presuming that Paul and Stuart and possibly Peter and his brother-in-law would probably like to do a future live on air with further explorations of this. But we've actually come to the time where we should close. We said we were only going to go 30-35 minutes for our first one, just while we sorted out technical issues. Is there any closing comment? First of all, briefly from you, Stuart. I'm not trying to calm you down. I'm just trying to make sure that, you know, the audio gets a reasonable go. So, any final brief remark from you?
Underlying all this is an appreciation of two common terms: thinking about things top down and from the bottom up. if that interests you, you really ought to read Ridley, because I think that's a tremendously important concept that's relevant to everything we've said.
Thank you. And Stuart's written quite extensively about Ridley's distinction between the top-down and the bottom-up in evolutionary terms. Paul, any final brief comment from you?
I'm just wondering, you know, there's a whole world out there that one can't explain, or they haven't found the means to measure it or tap into it. Would telepathy have anything to do with this? I mean, I've read in 2 places in Africa. One of them, this was written by a magistrate in what was then the British Cape Colony. In the Northern Cape Province, he went out, he was responsible for that, and this was in the days of the ox wagons and mules and oxen. The different tribes always knew in advance about their arrival. They were on their way and that they were coming. And also sometimes he got news that some other chief had died or been killed, and there were no tom-toms, drums for communication. And each time he asked them, how did they know it? And they just said, I heard it. You know, would anything like that have anything to do with this memory business? It's some other kind of communication. They said they heard it, and I think Maria also mentioned a case similar to that, of somebody who just heard it, but he couldn't explain how.
Yeah, those are really good questions or observations. Telepathy is discussed quite a bit by Sheldrake. Of course, it's not something that's really very accepted within the world of materialist psychologists, you know, the ones that are more orientated to behaviorist theory. But I think for many people that have worked in social sciences, things like nursing, things like healthcare, ministry, that sort of thing, one becomes aware of all kinds of stories that don't fit conventional science. Yeah. And I think that telepathy probably is in that category. Okay, well, thank you both very much for participating. Stuart, I'm terribly sorry. It's one of the few times that I've ever been able to say, I'm sorry you can't speak. We would dearly love to have had your contribution, but the audio was not with us. And
his voice came through quite clearly in the beginning before it started.
Yes, something occurred, yeah. Okay, well, thank you, and this will be available to everyone. I've got to do quite a bit of editing on it, so it may be 24, 48 hours before I put it up in its final form in YouTube. But thank you indeed, and we look forward to seeing all of you later on. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.